this video, we're going to see on how to work with Angular events using broadcast, emit, and on. Let's quickly check on what exactly are events. Events are nothing but a mechanism of notifying changes of state of data in our system to other parts of the system. Let's consider a simple scenario. The user modifies the salary of an employee. I would like to turn this as an event, because I might have other business functionality or workflow which needs to be performed based on the above change. That is, I would like to have some kind of reassessment of the employee benefits or calculate his deductions, inform to other departments about the change, and so on. So I might have several other business functionality related tasks to be performed whenever the employee salary gets modified or changed. So if such is the case, I am going to say, okay, this is going to be an event. So whenever I say event, it is just a way of notifying other parts of our application that a change has occurred. So once the change has been occurred, then you can handle that event in such a way that you can perform your own business functionality whenever that change really occurs. Event raising. An event means the way of notifying a change. Raising an event means you are literally notifying the change to other parts of the system. So in this case, I can name my event as something like EMP sal change. You can provide any kind of event name which could be meaningful based on your business scenarios. And whenever I say raise event, then we can say like, okay, AngularJS is going to shout to every part of the system saying that this event has been raised and this is the new information based on whatever it has received. So that is called event raising. So you are notifying a change across your system. Event raising or raising an event can also be called as publishing an event or producing an event or notifying a change and so on. There are several synonyms for the same concept called raising an event. So whenever you see these words, event producing or event publishing or event raising or event notifying, all are same. The next one is event handling. So we are saying that we are notifying a change using an event. And when we are notifying something, there should be something else which can actually capture that event and perform its own business logic. And that is called event handling. So event handling is the one which continuously tries to listen for any of the notifications which might be raised by a particular event. So the job of an event handler is nothing but to listen for a particular event. And whenever that event gets raised, this handler, as it is continuously listening, is going to get that notification and it will receive the data and it tries to do its own business functionality or business workflow based on the data it has received whenever the respective event has been raised. You will also call that one as capturing the raised event on a particular change or handling of the notification. So usually we write event handlers to execute our own business logic or any kind of logic for that matter whenever a change occurs. So the event in this case is EMP sal changed. Whenever this event is raised, I would like to have my own function to be executed called do reassess benefits. And this function is nothing but an event handler, which means it handles the event whenever that particular event gets raised. It is also called as subscribing to an event. So whenever you say you have written an event handler, literally nothing but you are subscribing to a particular event, which means if you call the raising of an event as publishing, you will be calling the handling of an event as subscribing. So publishing versus subscribing. Publishing means raising, subscribing means handling. So similarly, event producer, if you are using the word event producer, you are going to call the opposite as event consumer. Similarly, raiser, handler, notifier, or receiver. So we have various words which actually serve the same purpose regardless of what kind of technology you might be using. Further, you can have multiple handlers for the same event. So whenever I say multiple handlers, you can literally have too many number of event handlers listening to the same event. So which means whenever an event gets raised, all of the respective event handlers get automatically immediately executed and they perform their own business logic based on whatever the developer might be writing. So in simple, these are nothing but events. So we have events, event raising, nothing but publishing an event and subscribing an event. And how does AngularJS events really work with respect to our particular application? And what are they in general? And how are they different from jQuery events or JavaScript events? First of all, AngularJS related events are not DOM related events. And we can also say those are not UI related events. So those are not button click events or something like drop down list changed or checkbox changed events. Those are not that sort. These are really a kind of logical events which will be available as part of your application. And those AngularJS events can only be available and be understood through AngularJS. So if you would like to handle AngularJS events through jQuery or DOM, that's not the way to go. So you can't use jQuery or DOM to really make use of AngularJS events. And even if you can use it in one way or another using some hacky way, that's not quite recommended. While you are working with AngularJS events, you have both ways, predefined and custom. Predefined means AngularJS framework already has come up with several events as part of their system, and even if you are familiar with routing, you will be seeing on route change event or route success or route stop or route error. Similarly, if you are using UI router, you have state change, state success, and so on. So those are all various events which are already made available as part of AngularJS. And on top of that, you can define your own custom events. So it means if the developer decides okay, this is an event which I would like to make it available as part of my application, then you call that one as a custom event. So in my previous slide, I used EMP sal changed. Employee salary changed is not an event which actually comes through AngularJS. It is an event which will be defined by the developer and for the application purposes. So if the developer defines a new event on his own and handles on his own, then you call that one as a custom event defined by the developer. So as I mentioned, AngularJS custom events are nothing but the events which are actually created and introduced by the developer. And when those events are created by developer, it is going to be the responsibility of the developer himself to actually raise those events. So whenever I say raise the events, you are essentially notifying that this event is supposed to be propagated across the whole system in such a way that all the respective listeners should actually capture the data which is going to be sent by this particular event and handled by developer. So those custom events, while theirs are being raised by developer, those need to be handled by the developer too. And event raiser, which means whenever you publish an event or raise an event, you send the data, and whenever you are trying to handle an event, you are actually receiving the data, whatever that particular event has been raised and sending. And how to work with custom events as part of our AngularJS. Whether you work with custom events or predefined events, we need to raise it somewhere and handle it somewhere. So if it is predefined events, Angular system knows how to raise the events, and all you have to do is just handle those events. But in the case of custom events, we have to raise our own event, and we should be handling those events in whatever the way we want it. So how to raise an event? So you can also call it as how to notify, how to publish, how to produce an event. So all of these mean the same. We have two ways of actually raising an event, that is broadcast and emit. So we can use either of these two options whenever we would like to have any kind of event to be raised as part of our system. And along with those two options, we can also raise that event at two levels. One is at the scope level and the other one is at the root scope level. So we can use either of those two to actually raise the events using broadcast and emit at any of those two levels. And this is particularly about raising an event. And imagine I would like to handle an event which could be raised by a predefined event or by a custom event. So regardless of any kind of event which is going to be raised, that is either predefined or custom, you should be able to handle it somewhere. So how to handle an event, or how to receive the event notification, or how to subscribe to an event, or how to consume an event. So all of these mean the same. So how to handle an event? You will be using on. So $on is the word or the method which is available as part of AngularJS and is mainly used to handle an event or to subscribe to an event. And again, you can use that at two levels, either at the scope level or at the root scope level. So in order to raise an event, you use broadcast or emit, and in order to handle an event, whether it is predefined or custom, you will be using $on. So let us see the combination of broadcast and on. How broadcast works and how on works as part of our application, and how does the broadcast really work whenever we are having multiple controllers or nested scopes and so on. So let us consider a simple scenario like this. So that is, I have three controllers. We have controller 1, 2 and 3. So these three controllers are just siblings, so which means those will not have any relation to each other. So those are totally independent, and one controller will not have any understanding about the other. So similarly, I have two more controllers inside the controller 1. So that is, I have two child controls. So we have child controller 1 and another one is child controller 2. So those two are the nested controllers, or say children of the parent called controller 1. And as you know, every controller can have its own scope, and in this case you can see I have scopes in each of those controllers including the children. And on top of all of these I have a root scope. So which means, as you know, all of the scopes in one way or another inherit from the root scope, and root scope will be always available at the very top beyond any kind of controller, and we can always work with root scope even at the module level as well. Okay. Now imagine I'm trying to perform a broadcast, so which means I'm trying to raise an event using $broadcast method. So $broadcast, as you know, it is available at both $scope and even at the $root scope level. So which means I can use $broadcast either using scope or root scope. So using a broadcast, I can actually say that this is the name of the event which I would like to raise. And while we are trying to raise this event called EMP-SAL changed, I also would like to provide some kind of data to all the listeners, that is to all the event handlers. So in this case, I am raising an event that is EMP-SAL changed, and that too at this scope level. So you can see I am raising only at this scope level. So which means I wrote this line inside controller 1, and this scope is actually this scope. So I am actually raising this event in this controller 1. So what happens after that? The first thing is that the Angular system or AngularJS framework will check whether there are any event handlers in the current scope. So if the current scope is having EMP-SAL change in the form of an event handler using $on, that gets executed. And again, this function is going to receive this event related data in the form of data variable here. And this function is going to be called as the event handler. So this function gets executed whenever this event gets raised on the scope wherever currently it is getting executed. So in this case, this is the scope and this is the controller. And if you have this code inside this controller, that is going to be executed first. And whether or not it is available, it will be immediately going to the child controller, and it will check whether the same event handler kind of a deal is available at the scope level of that child controller. If it exists, that gets executed as well. So which means along with the parent, it also goes to the child controller and executes there. The next one is, again, it further goes to the child controller. That is, in this case, we have a second child controller. If you have nested child controllers, yes, those will also be touched, and those will also be checked for this event handler. And if they have those will be executed as well. So in this case, you can see, even though the scope is at the parent level, and even though you are raising an event at the controller, that is the parent controller level, it actually checks the current scope of the parent controller, and then it also checks through all the child controllers and start executing those events which might be already having the registration or say event handlers already associated with the respective scopes of all of those child controllers and the nested child controllers if available. So that is one way to understand. So a broadcast means it is not just only the current scope. It includes the current scope and all the children and all the nested scopes as well. So that is what is called as broadcast. Next, imagine I'm actually doing a broadcast at this level. So the same event I'm trying to raise here. But in this case, as you can see, it will be just checking for $on in the current controller for the current scope. If it is available, it gets executed. If not, it just can't execute. It will be just simply left in trash. So once that is done, there are no nested controllers here, no children, nothing. So it will be done forever. So if you raise a broadcast event in a controller which has got no child controllers or no child scopes, it will not really go further. Next, imagine I'm actually doing at the innermost controller or the nested controller, and there are no more nested controllers inside or no more children. Still, it works in the same fashion. It just searches for the respective event handler in the current controller only, and as there will not be any kind of nested controllers, it gets terminated right there. Next, this is a different one. Now I am not using $scope. Instead, I am using $root scope. Even though you are actually writing this statement, that is root scope.broadcast, in some other controller, it could be in controller 2 or even in the child controller, doesn't matter. But you are raising an event not in the current scope, you are actually raising an event at the root scope, and now you can see you are actually raising it at the root scope level. So even though you write this statement in the controller, or a child controller or a nested controller, doesn't matter. You are actually raising an event at the root scope. Whenever you raise an event at the root scope level, it actually checks whether the root scope related event handler is associated in the current root scope or not. So if you have this kind of code written anywhere in your system, regardless of any kind of controller, that is going to be executed. So that is pretty important. Whether you write this code at the module level or the controller level or the child controller level, wherever you write it, as long as that particular event is being raised at the root scope level and you have the handlers written for the root scope level in any of the controllers including the child controllers, those events or those event handlers get executed regardless. And once that part is done, so which means all the root scope related event handlers are completed, then it actually jumps to the scope. Now, the scope related events or event handlers get executed right from the very top. So the first one in this case is controller 1. And in the controller 1, it goes to the scope and checks whether it has got any kind of event handler for the same event. And if there is one, it gets executed. If not, it goes to the next one. So in this case, you can see it goes from the parent to the child and checks again for these event handlers in the child. And if they exist, they are executed. If not, it just simply goes to the next one. So in that way, it actually goes through every controller and every child controller and every nested child controller and searches for all those event handlers for their scopes only. So the first thing is that whenever you go with the $root scope, it checks for $root scope related event handlers. Once those are done, it actually goes through the scope related event handlers with the same name, and those will be getting executed. So this is pretty much about broadcast. And if you see carefully, whenever you raise a broadcast event, it actually goes all the way from the top to the down. So if you raise inside the controller, it gets executed inside the parent controller first, next go to the child, next nested, and so on. So the direction is always from top to bottom. So wherever you raise, it goes just down inside it. It will not go up. It just goes down and nested further. So the direction of a broadcasting of an event is always from the top to the bottom. It starts from the scope of the broadcast. So if you are writing the $broadcast inside a controller, it starts there, and then it ends within the same scope of the controller, including all the children and the nested. So it covers entire scope of the broadcast. So this entire scope will be covered if you raise here. As you are raising root scope here, it actually goes through the entire system in this case. And broadcast whether or not you handle events. So this is important. So even though you actually handle those events or not, it just goes through every scope and checks for those event handlers if they are available. If not, those will never be executed at all. This is pretty much about broadcast. So let us quickly check on $emit. And while we are checking the $emit, we also work with $on anyway. So again, the same example. So I have a root scope and 3 different controllers, and the first one is a parent controller with 2 children, that is child controller 1 and 2. So let us see how $emit works here. So imagine I am raising $scope.$emit. So which means this is also raising an event, very similar to broadcast. This is also sending some kind of data. And this line currently is being written right inside controller 1. So I am raising this event inside controller 1, and what happens next? So the first thing is that it is pretty similar. It will be checking whether you are handling that particular event in the current scope or not. If it is so, it gets executed. Then further, it actually goes to the next level, to the up. So it will not go down. In fact, it actually goes up. That is to the root scope level. So the parent scope, or the parent of this controller, in this case it is at the module level or at the root scope level. So it will not go down. Broadcast goes down, but the emit actually goes up. So as we are raising from the parent controller here, it will not go down anymore, but it actually tries to go up, as because in this case that is the rootmost controller available. I mean, not the root controller, but that is the parentmost controller. It actually goes to the root scope level in this case. So now it checks whether you are handling the event at the root scope level. So if you have written this code anywhere in your application, regardless of what controller it is, whether it is controller 1, 2, 3 or child controllers or nested, this code gets executed. So if the root scope gets touched, it is pretty sure that it actually goes through the entire system and tries to invoke all those event handlers registered at the root scope level. So if you think and really understand carefully, this is the easiest way on how you can send data from one controller to another. So which means you can raise an event from here to the root scope level. You can send some data to root scope level, and as it is available at the root scope level, it will be understood by every controller, and you can handle that event in whatever the controller you want it, and you can receive that data from some other controller where there will not be any relation between the controllers at all. So that is one way of actually passing the data across controllers. But again, that may not be efficient, but that is just one simple way which is available in order to send data from one controller to another. You can also use service, especially for that purposes, or if you really want it, you can import and work with your own Angular publishing and subscribing related libraries which may be available offline. But that is a different story. So in this case, as I mentioned, whenever you emit, it checks with the current scope. If the current scope has any event handlers, those get executed. If not, it goes to the previous controller, that is ancestor or the parent, and if it has got its own scope, that gets executed as well. If not, further it goes to the root scope. And if you have registered or handling the event at the root scope level regardless of any controller, that gets executed. Next, imagine I am actually emitting from some other controller very similar to controller 1. Now it is controller 2, and this is the scope. Again, the same story. It checks for the current scope related event. So if you are handling this kind of code inside this controller, that gets executed first. And once that is done, it actually goes back to root scope. And once it goes to root scope, again, it checks for this kind of an event in any of the controllers, including the children, including nested. Wherever this code is, that gets executed. And now I'm just working only with root scope, no dollar scope anymore. But even though I write this statement inside controller 3, I'm actually raising this event all the way at the root scope level. Now that means actually it checks for this code not only at the root scope level, but it checks for this code in any of the controllers, in any of the children, any of the nested, and everywhere, wherever this code is available, that gets executed. And now let us consider about the innermost, in this case, the second level child controller. So imagine I am writing this kind of code right inside the child controller, and the moment I say execute this, so which means it is going to check whether you have this kind of code in this scope. If that is there, that gets executed. And imagine that part is completed. Next it goes to the parent, that is the parent controller of this guy, in this case this one. And now it checks whether there exists this kind of code inside the parent. If that exists, that gets executed. Whether or not it exists there, next it actually goes to the root scope level, and from there we know that it actually goes through the entire system for this kind of code, and that gets executed. And now if you see the direction, it is always from bottom to top, unlike broadcast, which is always top to bottom. So it just goes in the opposite direction of the broadcast. And again, starts from the scope of emit. So in this case, you can see this is the starting point. It tries to execute there. It covers this entire scope, and on top of it, it goes along with all the parents and ancestors in the same direction, that is towards the top, and reaches all the way to the root scope. And again, it actually emits whether or not you handle the events. So if you handle the events, you are going to have them handled. If you don't handle them, those will be simply lost. So that is pretty much about how we can understand broadcast and emit and on, and we are going to jump into practicals now. I have a small example here, so which is currently having the parent controller and the child controller and another sibling controller. So you can see I have the NG controller. The first one is calculate 1, the second one is child 1 and calculate 1, and the third one is just calculate 2. So if you see the hierarchy, once I execute it, it is going to look something like this. I have a parent controller, and inside that I have a child controller. And on top of that, I have the sibling, which is actually at the same level as of the parent controller. So I have two controllers at the root level. And on top of that, I have a child controller inside one of the parent controllers. So I have three controllers in overall. So if I just press F5, you are going to see all the data here, 30, 40, and the sum is 70, 10 and 20, the sum is 30 here. So if I go back here, you can see how it has been organized. So all I have is A and B at the parent controller and C and D at the sibling controller. And this is the child controller of the parent. Currently it doesn't have any of the bindings, so it is empty there. So A and B of the parent, currently you can see those are being displayed in here, and at the same time I have the sum being displayed right at that location. And similarly I have the sibling with 30 and 40 for C and D, and that is the sibling right here. So I have C and D with C plus D. And the child controller currently just have only the message and no data. So this is a very simple example what I have in place, and let us try to demonstrate how the emit works, and then we are going to go to broadcast and further with the root level emits or root level broadcast. So let us start with a simple button at probably at my parent level. So in this case I would like to introduce a button, and I'd like to call this button as something like calculate 1, and I'm going to use emit event. So I would like to call emit 1. So this is just the caption in this case. Now I would like to go with ng-click. So what code needs to be executed, and in this case I would like to execute a function or a method called do calculate 1 emit 1. So that is the method name I would like to use. So I would like to write this one right inside my parent controller. So I would like to have my scope to be having the same method, and that particular method is going to be having something like a function which essentially emits the event. So in this case I do not want to send any data here. I just would like to emit the event and see on how I can really consume that event elsewhere. So I am going to use the current scope level. So I'm not using the root scope yet. So I'm just using current scope dot $emit. So you are going to have emit, and what is the event name? So you can provide any event name. So in this case I would like to use the same name as I used here, that is calculate 1 emit 1 event. So just would like to use the same kind of event name. So this is a simple event which I'm trying to raise using emit, and I need to handle elsewhere. So the first thing I would like to handle is I would like to handle in the same scope or same controller if there is a possibility, and of course there is always. So in order to handle the event, as you know, I can just say scope.$on. So that is the simplest way on how to handle the event. And the first thing is that you need to provide the event name to which it needs to be associated with, and on top of that what function needs to be executed. So in this case that is the event handler, so which means this function is going to be executed whenever this event gets raised. So in this case I do not have any data because I'm not sending any data here. So this will be null in this case, but if you would like to have more details of the event, that is the way to go. And on top of that I would like to use just the console.log in this case. So I just would like to say this is my calculate event, and you can just provide calc1.this. So just to make ourselves clear, you are saying that in the console log you are just providing this message. This is just an ordinary string message. You can provide any message here, but in this case I would like to use the controller name dot whatever that particular event being handled, so that we can be really clear where this has been raised. So you can provide any data here. So you can also raised by emit. You can just put whatever the comment you would like to say. Okay, on top of that, imagine I would also like to use the scope related emit as well. So which means I would like to use or handle the same event at the root scope level as well. So you can say I already injected scope and root scope here, so I'm using the same variable root scope right here. So which means now you're saying that I'm going to handle that emit event not only at the scope level and also at the root scope level. So as mentioned in my presentation, emit means it actually goes from the bottom to the top. So which means it actually goes to the controller first wherever it is going to be executed, and from there it goes to the parent. So in this case there is no parent, and now it actually goes from here to the root scope, and from the root scope wherever this one is made available, that gets executed. So I save this, and currently I'm handling events only the calc 1 level. So let us see this first, and then we are going to go further to the nested levels like child calculate and calculate 2. So let us go back here, press F5, and now you can see I have the button. So the moment I click on that, you can see I have calculate1.myCalculateEmit event. So that is the simplest way on how we can really get that one raised and handled. And let us go back to my application here, and in this case I would like to have a better message. I would like to say something like root.calculate.myCalculateEvent. So that will be better. So I'm going to say this one as well. Now I go back, I just press F5 and click on this one, and now you can see I have both. So which means I have calculate1.myCalculateEmit, and at the same time you can see root.calculate. So the first one which gets executed is the scope level, and once the scope level of the current one, which is parent level scope, is done, it actually goes to the root scope and tries to execute everything related to the scope. And you can see currently I have this handler only at the parent level. So let me use the same thing and try to write something at the sibling level. So this is a sibling, and this is the child controller. So I'm going to use the same thing, but instead of writing calculate 1 here, I'm going to say something like sibling, and this one I would like to say something like child controller, so that will have a better understanding. Now I go back here, press F5, and the moment I say calculate emit here, now you can see it is not only being executed or handled at the current calculate level, that is current controller level, that is parent. It is being executed or handled at multiple other locations, including the child controller and even at the sibling controller. So you can see whether you actually use the scope or not, but if you associate anything to the root scope, and if you handle that event using the root scope.on in any of the controllers, regardless of wherever their position is, that code gets executed. So that is pretty important. But imagine I'm writing the same $scope right here in my sibling. So that is this one, and I would like to call this one as sibling dot. And emit does not go to the siblings at all, not even the nested. So it actually goes through the parent. So let me go back here. So whenever I emit from here, it tries to go into the parent controller first and goes to the ancestor, but it doesn't go to the sibling. So if I click on this one, you can see there is no sibling.myCalculate. So that code is not going to be executed. So this code is meaningless because it will never be executed. So that is pretty much about emit in general. So let us quickly see on how the broadcasting of event could be done. So for the broadcasting of event, in this case, I would like to again add one more button, and that too at the parent level. And I would like to call this one as something like calculate 1, and probably I would like to call this one as broadcast 1. That is easier. And calculate 1, this is going to be broadcast 1 method. So you can just provide any kind of method name here, and I need to handle that even in my application. So I'm going to say something like again scope dot that the same method, whatever I asked it to execute, and this is going to be the function which is supposed to be executed. So inside this, what am I supposed to write inside this? Again, the same kind of console, not the console, the same kind of statement, but instead of using emit, I'm going to use broadcast. So let us see what happens inside the broadcast. And I would like to have some difference in my naming. So I would like to say calculate1.broadcast, calculate1.broadcast event. So that is the name. And I would like to handle that one first inside my existing controller. So I would like to have the same kind of scope related event handler here, and instead of the previous event I would like to use the current event here and see how it works. Okay, so let us see if this is going to work. So I go back here, press F5, and the moment I say broadcast, yes, it works. And you can see right now we are actually trying to raise the event in the same controller and handle the same event in the same controller. So in that way I am able to raise and handle the event in the same controller. So let us copy the same code in the child controller, and this is the sibling controller. So I'm going to call this one as sibling, and in this case this is going to be the child. And as we know, the broadcast will never go through the siblings, so this code is not going to be executed. But let us see if that is really executing at all. But this has to execute, because from the parent the broadcast actually goes to the child and tries to execute this one as well. So we need to see this immediately after the parent. So let us see how this is going to work. So I go back here, press F5, and now click on broadcast, and now you can see I have the parent first. So this is the parent which gets executed, and immediately after that I have the child controller. So you can see I have the child here, and that related controller received the event, and we have the associated event handler through the scope, and that gets executed. But we did not get the sibling because that is not part of broadcast. So the broadcast always goes with the current controller, current scope, and all the child controls and the nested controllers, but never the siblings. So in that way, whatever the code you might be writing as part of the sibling will not be executed, and in this case this is going to be meaningless. So let us go to the next level. That is, I would like to broadcast at the root level. So I would like to use one more button, and I would like to call this one as something like root broadcast. You can call any name. So this is going to be the caption, and calculate 1, and I would like to call broadcast root instead of broadcast 1. Okay, so I just want to copy this. I go back here, go to my parent controller, and again I would like to write this one, what to be executed. So in this case I would like to have the same kind of a deal, that is same kind of statement, except that instead of scope I would like to say root scope, because I would like to actually raise at the root scope level but not at the current scope level. And this is going to be different event, not the same event as the previous one. So I'm going to call this one as something like calculate 1 broadcast event. So that is going to be the broadcast level, and again we need to handle that somewhere. So I would like to make use of the same thing here. So just similar to the previous one, I would like to have one more event handler, but with a different name, that is my broadcast event. It's not the broadcast event, this is supposed to be broadcast root event. So let me rename this a bit. I copy this, and let us be a bit more specific. I would like to call this one as parent, so that we all can understand what's going on, and this one also being parent, and this is broadcast root, by the way. And on top of that, as it is root scope level, so you can see we are raising at the root scope level, I would like to have one more event handler at the root scope level as well and see what's going on. So I go in here, and instead of scope I would like to use root scope level, and this is going to be something like a root.parent. So just for our understanding, so let us see what's going on here. I go back, I press F5, and we are going to see one more button, and once I click on this one we are actually going to broadcast at the root scope level. So whenever you actually go to the root scope level, first it tries to execute all the root scope related event handlers, and on top of that it also goes through every controller, checks the scope of the current event, and if the scope has the current event, even that also going to be executed. So I click on this one, and now you can see the first thing it has executed is root.parent. So if you go back here, you can see it has executed root scope related event, and immediately after that it has executed parent.root event. So if you go back here, parent.root event, you can see it actually executed even the second one as well. So whether or not you use root scope or scope to handle the events, if you actually raise at the root scope level, it is going to be executed in every scope, or not just the every scope, it also goes through the root scope as well. So you can also copy this and try to handle it in every other controller. So in this case, it is going to be something like sibling, and this is going to be sibling as well. And let us copy one more. And this is going to be child, and this is going to be child as well. And for that matter, you can also handle events at the module level. So how can we handle at the module level? We can actually write our own app.run, and inside this I would like to inject root scope, and I would like to use $root scope here. You can use any variable. And this is the one which gets executed immediately once the module has been initialized. So in this case, I would like to use again the same kind of event. So I would like to use a root also here. So I can use something like this. So I do not want anything specific here. I would like to say root dot. So it is just only the root event. So for that matter, you can use any kind of root event wherever you might be writing. So in that case, I can also use another root scope related event to be handled at the root level as well. So you can use any kind of root levels, but not really the scope, because the module level, there will not be any scope other than root scope. So you have only the options to actually handle at the root scope level if you have any kind of interest with respect to your application. So we can also have our root scope related events to be handled at the module level using this. But if it is at the controller level, you can use this way. So let us see all of this together. I go back, press F5, and let us talk to the root broadcast first. And the moment I click on that, now you can see the first thing is that it has gone to the root.myCalculate. This is at actually the module level. So you can see this is at the module level. So probably if we write this one, then probably that gives more understanding on where it has started. So I go back here, press F5, click on this, and you can see it has started at the module level because that is the root scope at the module level. And immediately it has gone to the parent, that is parent controller, and immediately after that it has gone to the child. So it has gone to this one, and after that it has gone to the sibling, and you can see it is, once that is done, then it started going through the scope, not the root scope, just the scope of every controller. So in this case I have the parent related scope related controller, we have the child scope, and we also have the sibling. So in that way we have all the events covered here just with one root broadcast. So that is the easiest way on how you can really pass any kind of information from one part to another regardless of any controller or any scope in your entire system. So that is the easiest way. And now let us go to the next level, that is go to the child, that is at the emit level, that is at the child controller level. So in this case I would like to have one more button, and I would like to have something like child1 calculate1 emit, and I would like to call this one as emit1. You can call anything. So at the same time I would like to say ngClick, and I would like to call this one as do child1 calculate1 emit1. So this is going to be the event which is supposed to be handled at the child level. Sorry, that is not an event, there's a method which needs to be written. So I go to the child controller here. Now I actually try to write something inside the child controller. So as I am trying to write some kind of logic inside the child controller, you can see I am trying to write for the emit but not for the broadcast yet. So I am going to say scope.do, and this is going to be the child1 emit1. Okay, all I have to do here is that I have to write scope.$emit, and in this case I am going to say the same value, that is child1 calculate1 emit. So I'm going to use this one here. So the name of the event is going to be this, and no data at the moment, so I just wanted to emit only from the child. So that is going to be the end. And now I need to handle it. So in order to handle it, again, I will be writing the code something similar to this one. And so it's not necessarily be a scope first. So I start with scope, not the root scope. And the name of the event in this case is going to be my child1 calculate1, and this is also child, and this is being raised by emit. And similarly, I would also like to go with root scope. So you can see I already have the root scope here. I just would like to use the root scope here as well. So this is not root, it is just only the child. So similarly, I would like to use the same thing everywhere and see wherever it makes sense. So as this is child, I am certain that it has to go to parent, because emit actually goes from the child to the parent to the ancestors. So let me put that even in the parent as well. So this is the parent, and I would like to have two more here, and I call this one as parent, and I would like to handle the root scope regardless. And this is, so this is root, but this is going to be the parent. And similarly, sibling. So this is my sibling. So emit will not go to the sibling, so there is no point of actually writing the scope. So but it actually goes through the root scope, so this one still makes sense in one way or another. So I would like to use the sibling here as well. And on top of that, root scope means it can be available even at the global level. So I can use the same thing here, but I will not have access to scope here. So all I have is just the root scope, and in this case I am going to say this one as module. So let us go back here. I press F5, and the moment I say click emit, we are going to see it has started at the child related scope. So this is the scope level event, and again this is the parent scope level event, and after that it has switched to the root scope, and from there it has gone to the module level root, parent level root, and again child level root, and even the sibling level root. So if you have any kind of event registered at the root scope level, that particular event is going to be executed regardless of wherever its position is as part of your system. So this is pretty much about on how you can use broadcast and emit, and however we also need to understand on how to send the data. So that is how to pass the data and how to handle that particular data information as well. So for that purpose I would like to use the same kind of button. So I would like to have one more button here, and I would like to call this one as child1, probably emit2. So I would like to call this one as emit2 in this case, and I am going to say this one is emit2 with data. So this is going to be our new method. So I am going to use this. So where is my code here? So I am going to use this one here. I am going to say scope dot, that is my function name, and I am going to write the function here. So in this event, this is going to be pretty much similar to what we did earlier. So I'm going to use the same emit. You can use anything. In this case, I would like to use emit, but the name of the event is going to be a bit different. So I would like to have child1 calculate1 emit2. So that is going to be my event. And on top of that, I would like to send some data. So you can provide any data. In this case, I would like to send A and B values as A 100 and B has 200 in this case. I would like to handle particularly in the parent, because this one actually propagates to the parent and even to the ancestors and even to the root scope. So in this case I do not want to go through all the other ways of handling, but I just would like to receive this data from the child controller to the parent controller. So all I have to do is just handle this event. So I go back to the controller, that is the parent. So where is this? This is the parent. So I go to the scope. I want to use the scope level handler here, so that is the one, and let me actually collapse this guy. I'm not using this. So what is the name of the event? So that is my child1 calculate emit2. So that is the event. So I'm going to use this event. I'm going to use this event too. And now let me put some information here, and I'm going to say data, that is .a in this case, and I would like to say something like data.a. Why? Because that object will be made available to this variable data. It could be O or anything. So .a gives this particular value. .b gives this particular value. So this whole object will be actually made available through data. So I can access any of these members using dotted notation here. So let us see if I am able to get it. So I go press F5. At the moment I click on this, now you can see the parent has received data from the child controller using the emitting of events, and it received the value of A as 100. And imagine I would like to have all of these to be refreshed, like instead of A with 10, I would actually modify the scope of the parent based on the values it received from the child. So instead of using this, I just would like to comment that I am going to say use my current scope and actually get the value of, set the value of A to whatever we receive from the event. So this is the easiest way. So I use that, I go back here, press F5, and again I click on this, and now you can see it has actually modified 10 and 20 to 100 to 200, and at the same time even the sum is also respected in the same fashion. So that is the way on how we can actually broadcast and emit the events, and at the same time handle the events, send the data, receive the data, and at the same time handle the events at the module scope level, that is at the root scope at the module level.